Welcome to part 2 of my presentation on how and why China is a military threat to Australia. Part 1 asked the question why. I argued that internal factors are far more important to their regime than any other consideration. More bluntly, no matter how insane we consider any Chinese military aggression would be against Australia, the reality is that some type of raid is desirable to the regime provided they can obtain a propaganda benefit, avoid escalation, and avoid American involvement. Now, the last chapter of my book is actually a scenario based on the concepts discussed in the earlier chapters. I've been made to understand that it was a mistake making it the last chapter, and that should always lead with a scenario to generate interest. Honestly, I still prefer having the scenario at the end. One last point before I go on. The definition of escalation I use here and in my book is, quite simply, when the tempo of combat combined with casualties continuously increases. With regards to China, it refers to their fear of uncontrollable escalation. The first thing you will notice in this presentation is the absence of a large-scale invasion or, if you like, a war of conquest. That risk will only develop if 4 conditions are met. They are a continued growth in Chinese naval power, the fall of Taiwan, the withdrawal of America from the Western Pacific, either by choice or by force, and a prolonged domestic propaganda campaign targeting Australia. At this time, only one of the conditions have been met. Therefore, if you accept my assessment of the results China will seek from any military conflict, the most likely form of military adventure is some type of raid. It is important to remember that even though I have called this action a raid, the result for Australia could prove quite devastating. Rather strangely, to my thinking, a major war is the best outcome for the current and proposed structure of the ADF, yet it is the one we are most unlikely to face. In my book, I drew up a list of raids and explained which are unlikely based on China's strategic culture. The following is drawn from the discussion in my book. However, once again, this presentation is just an overview. The first type of raid is an incursion. In an incursion, a Chinese warship or Air Force plane or planes enters or threatens to enter another country's airspace or territorial waters. Obviously, Taiwan is currently the primary target. This chart here shows the number of warplane incursions by month broken down by day. To give you some idea of the scale, the January incursion was equal to a push by the Allied air forces over Iraq in 2001 when they were enforcing the no-fly zone. It's an extraordinarily large number of planes. Navy ships, but especially Chinese Coast Guard vessels, use the same tactics, not just against Taiwan, but also Japan and the Philippines. Then we have minor border disputes using ground forces. These are almost overwhelmingly against India, and the PLA's tactics are often just some sick parody of a Chinese martial arts film that results in pointless deaths on both sides. This type of stupidity is not available against Australia for obvious reasons. We're now starting to look at more serious threats. This represents an air bombardment using standoff munitions, and in this instance they were reportedly using drones similar to our emasculated Loyal Wingman program. Alternatively, the Chinese could look at a naval bombardment by surface ships using missiles, or a naval bombardment by submarines using missiles. Again, slightly less violent, we could be looking at an incursion by a major fishing fleet supported by heavily armed Chinese Coast Guard ships. We could also look at the Chinese putting boots on the ground with enough men and equipment that it is not easy to dislodge, but not enough to pose a serious risk to Australia as a whole. Finally, we have the unlikely wildcard, a small nuclear demonstration. This illustration shows the impact of a very small 2 kiloton tactical nuclear weapon It blurs the line between nukes and conventional weapons. It would require specific circumstances, and its aim would primarily be to convince America's allies that they could not rely upon EMD. I'm not going to go into this scenario in this presentation due to length. Let's look at why we should exclude some of these types of raids. We'll start by imagining the sight of a Chinese carrier task force sailing down the west coast of Australia while in our exclusive economic zone. It would certainly cause shockwaves throughout Australia, as well as a temporary bump for China's domestic propaganda efforts. However, realistically, the media reports on similar operations against Taiwan probably drop quickly below that of the price of fish in the local markets. The same would happen here. This rules out prolonged bouts of air or naval incursions unless the strategic situation changes quite dramatically. Before I continue on to the more aggressive raids, I would like to ask a question as to whether it is possible for China to conduct a damaging raid upon Australia that would not lead to escalation and American involvement. The answer, I believe, is yes. There was a perfect example that recently happened that showed how you can use America's domestic political dystopia to minimize its armed forces as a threat. It was a lesson that would have been well understood in China, but one almost completely ignored in Australia. It happened on the 13th of April of 2024 when Iran launched the single largest cruise and ballistic missile attack in history against another country. The scale of the attack dwarfed any single day's bombardment of the Ukraine by Russia. It was a declaration of war against America's most important partner in the Middle East by a country that literally calls the United States the Great Satan, and America blinked. Media reports state that the US president told the Israeli Prime Minister that America would not take part in any counterattack. One of the reasons the US president made this decision was largely due to Iran itself. Rather than launch a surprise attack, they actually gave the world 3 days' notice and stated they had no intention of waging a full-scale war. That was very nice of them. This ensured that virtually all the missiles in the attack would be intercepted, which appears a strange tactic by Iran. Yet, a surprise attack would have initiated an immediate military response. The 3 days between Iran announcing an attack and actually launching it allowed American leadership to engage in what it now does best: discussion, obtaining advice from different agencies that provide multiple recommendations, focus groups to assess the political impact, and intense political lobbying. The end, inevitably, was exactly what Iran wanted: procrastination leading to inaction, which meant no escalation. It provided a propaganda victory for one of the most repressive regimes in the world. The Iranian domestic political success of the 13th of April attack has actually accelerated the risk of some form of military action against Australia. Quite simply, China must ensure the Yanks have enough time to choke, which now brings us to assessing the most likely types of raids against Australia. An air or surface vessel raid using long-range land attack missiles are, on one hand, seemingly safe options, but they're actually quite dangerous for China. Obviously, such an attack could be extremely devastating against a single target of Australia's small ADF. However, the visibility of these actions will almost certainly lead to escalation. Both would lead to an immediate response against the attacking planes or surface ships by at least Australia. The aircraft and ships would have to evade destruction, while the short timescales for the interception make American involvement almost certain due to the need for an immediate decision. This means the Chinese have lost control of 2 of the 3 outcomes they must achieve in any military action. That is, avoiding escalation and the involvement of America. Therefore, both these types of raids are off the table. The first of the types of raid most suitable for a Chinese attack is a naval bombardment by submarines using missiles. While this may seem identical to an air or surface ship attack, there is one very important difference. Chinese sub-launch cruise missiles reportedly have a 500-kilometre range, while newer models match the Tomahawk's range and ordnance. should China wish to make a military demonstration against an Australian target, a surprise missile launched from a submarine minimises the risk of escalation or American involvement. Launching from outside of the drawn footprint minimises the risk associated with any launch. Equally, the greater the range at which the missile is launched determines the length of time for any response. The longer the response time, the greater the likelihood of the submarine evading destruction. The risk of escalation remains, but becomes more unlikely with every passing hour. The likelihood of an American counterstrike decreases with every tick of the clock as Washington looks for a way out. However, there is always a chance an American president will do a Margaret Thatcher and launch a proportional strike and take out a Chinese target elsewhere. If that happens, then domestic opinion will demand satisfaction and China's leadership would have lost control and escalation will result. Remember, the aim for China is to detach America's other allies by a demonstration against Australia, not start a major war. An interesting aside is that the most likely form of naval aggression against Australia is in the form of China's so-called grey zone warfare. Let's be honest here, it's actually Western cowardice. A large deep-water fishing fleet appearing in Australia's exclusive economic zone, either in the Indian or Antarctic Oceans, is, with Australia's current ADF, impossible to deter. Without significant public discussion leading to support for Australia taking action, combined with some type of capability to implement it, nothing is going to happen. Theoretically, for China, it avoids any serious escalation and will have almost no American involvement, so that fulfills two of the three criteria for China. It does not, however, provide a direct boost to China's domestic propaganda. Its benefit is in maintaining the sea products needed to avoid domestic unrest. Well, we are actually starting to run out of options. What we are left with is, counterintuitively, boots on the ground. This is the type of raid in the scenario in my book. It helped that I enjoyed the process of putting it all together, plus adding a few other factors that didn't fit into the body of the book. Once more, I've left a lot out of this presentation. Note that the scenario in my book was written pre-DSR. It is my opinion that the changes to the ADF have actually made this type of raid far more likely. The question, as always, is actually getting the boots on the ground. The actual method of getting them there must use means whose destruction will not overshadow the actual landing. Again, using my scenario as an example, I actually envisaged a covert landing. I'll leave it to you to decide if you can come up with how or an alternative method. And now we come back to why, or if you like, the desired outcome of such a raid. These are the relevant requirements for a raid ending in a minor Chinese landing in Australia. First of all, they need an event or development that can allow the Chinese government to present Australia as a threat. The force has to be large enough to have an impact, but small enough so it was clearly not a major invasion. In the scenario in the book, it was a PLA Marine battalion. Logistically, it had to get a light armoured formation on site. It needed to avoid escalation by using transport whose loss would not lead to Chinese domestic demands for escalation. It needed to create a delay by picking an isolated location which would take time for the ADF and the Australian government to realise what was happening. It needed to avoid an immediate response. The primary responder would initially be the RAAF. Therefore, the occupation of a small town would prevent immediate attacks of any type simply due to the risk of civilian casualties. No Australian politician is going to allow an attack on an Australian town that will cause dead men, women and children. Isolation and Australian hesitation will delay any American response. It has to have a propaganda benefit. In the scenario, the raiding force was met by a Chinese family who were supposedly fleeing from an internment camp for ethnic Chinese. allegations and demands for protection of ethnic Chinese form the basis of a propaganda campaign, both domestic and international. China would state that it had no intent for a wider war, and it only acted in response to Australian provocations and to protect Chinese citizens. It was, of course, seeking a diplomatic outcome. The aim was prevarication by America, and that would almost certainly be achieved. And the outcome was loss of confidence in the major American partners around the South China Sea. The perfect outcome would result in Japan no longer allowing America to use Japanese air bases in defense of Taiwan. In conclusion, a boots-on-the-ground scenario fulfills all the outcomes desired by the Chinese regime, which are to satisfy the demand for action in response to domestic propaganda, to avoid escalation with America, and to put doubt in the minds of American allies. Trust is broken. These outcomes are actually not available against any other American ally in the Western Pacific. However, of course, all other types of raids are on the table in the right circumstances. The question now moves to whether Australia's strategic policy is capable of deterring Chinese military aggression against Australia. The question that follows on from that is whether the ADF has the ability to satisfy Australia's strategic policy, which, if the answer is no, is immediately followed by asking what is preventing the ADF from being fit for purpose. I've stated quite clearly in my previous presentations that Australia's strategic policy based around the DSR is taking us in the wrong direction. This is why my final presentation is a recommendation for a new strategic policy based on attrition that, by necessity, requires a new ADF structure. Before you think I am suggesting conscription, I am not. In fact, as I argue in my book, it would be a disaster based around our own strategic culture and political divide. If you agree with me that Australia's strategic policy is going in the wrong direction, and remember I am not alone in thinking that way, then before I get to giving an overview of my recommendations, we have to ask why we are unable to get the defence of Australia right. Generally, most blame follows the deep political divide that has developed in Australia. Certainly, there is a profound lack of public discussion in Australia. AUKUS, whether you agree with the program or not, was the most expensive arms procurement in Australian history. It should never have been signed off in secret, as happened, with only a few bureaucrats and politicians making the call. AUKUS provides a hint of where the real problem lies, and this is why the next presentation is on the Australian Defence Department. At this point, I would like to thank you for watching these presentations. I hope they get you talking, and I am looking forward to reading your comments.